I'm going to run through this quite quickly, but it's clear that, particularly I would say in the last 5 or 10 years, there's been, of course these limits have always been present, but there's been a lot more societal concern around questions of environmental limits. So briefly, there have been a whole bunch of natural science reports and attempts to quantify global limits. There's this paper some of you may have seen by Rockstrom and collaborators that I think has something like 14 different limits, and they talk about, you know, freshwater extractions mustn't be more than 4,000 cubic kilometers per year. We shouldn't have more than, we shouldn't lose more than 10 species per million per year, and so on. And it's a scientific-based attempt to quantify what are these major planetary limits. But that's just one example. You have, and I'm just picking the idea of ecological footprint analysis, and William Rees has played an important role in that. But that's something which clearly embodies an idea of limits, footprints. How far can we go? How close are we or beyond certain frontiers? Which is now, all of it, governments have used it, municipal governments, it's applied at the individual level. It's something that has kind of permeated environmental consciousness. Media discussion, you could put as an example, just in the last year, 18 months, Scientific American has had several articles talking about environmental limits and frontiers, for instance. And then there are renewed critiques of the growth economy. Some of these economists kind of look back to Herman Daly, but people like Peter Victor and Tim Jackson have recently issued books that are getting wide circulation that deal with the critique of the growth economy. So all of these are just examples of how, particularly in the last maybe decade, this idea of limits has become even more prominent in popular culture. Okay, so just very quickly again, some of the background to these. Why are limits more coming into discussion now? So one is climate change. It's been around for a couple of decades, and governments and societies are beginning to appreciate just how hard actually it is to control carbon emissions. 40 years of environmental policy, which has been incrementally very successful in the developed countries in dealing with particular kinds of pollution, and yet the absolute environmental burden on the planet continues to grow, because even though we use resources more efficiently, there are more of us consuming more of them. The oil price spikes and the whole debate about peak oil. For those of you, some of you who were around in the 70s, it's, some of these issues resonate. The emergence of rapidly developing countries and their kind of move towards consumerism, particularly China and India, suddenly has people saying, oh wow, I mean, all the oil's going to China, what's that going to do to us? Well, if you're in Alberta, perhaps you wish more oil was flowing to China. And then the perceived interrelatedness of global problems, which you see a lot of if you read newspaper editorials and so on. And a good example would be the recent surge and then fall in kind of popularity around biofuels, where biofuels is something to do with fuel and carbon emissions, but then they seem to feed into fuel prices, and farm subsidies, and everything seems, water use seems to be connected together. So all of these are just some of the reasons that limits is coming to the fore. The paradox of the present conjuncture. Well, I'm sure you've all kind of thought about this. On one hand, governments are still dealing with the kind of economic collapse in 2008, and particularly in Europe, there is serious economic stagnation. Growth seems to be the answer, but on the other hand, more growth looks set from the environmental perspective to deliver still more problems. Basically, in the environmental movement, there seems to be, perhaps environmental movement is the best word, let's say that those engaging with environmental issues, there are two major responses. One is kind of this call for green growth, and the other a call to end the era of economic growth. And basically I suggest that the debate between these perspectives, now each of them is very complex in itself, so I'm simplifying dramatically, seems to turn on beliefs about the extent to which decoupling is possible, the depth of the changes required to the existing economic system, and judgments about likely to be most helpful in moving things forward in the present context. So very briefly on these two things. Green growth, the idea is reorienting investment wealth creation along green lines, alter the character of growth, and that's just Stern, who was recently been talking about the importance of focusing on decarbonization and building a new energy system. And there are the three points I said the difference turns on. Decoupling is possible, change can be won incrementally, and it's better to target the worst environmental culprits at the present time. And then the other perspective, which is end the era of economic growth, so we should end it because the Earth can't take it, and it's not making us happier and better off anyway, and it won't resolve inequality. I'm caricaturizing, this is broad brush strokes. And then on these three, decoupling, well, it can't really be done. We need to fundamentally change the economy, and we need to target, we actually need explicitly to target growth economies. And here, I'll just give, just to fill out the no growth argument a little bit. What's happening? There we go. Just, this is something taken from Tim Jackson's book. He takes Ehrlich's famous formula. He says, let's focus it around climate change. So these are the things that go to make up greenhouse gas emissions, population, GDP per person, CO2 intensity of GDP. And then basically the argument is that we would have to improve emissions intensity so dramatically that it just isn't possible. So basically, to allow these three things, 0.7% population growth per year, 2% economic growth per year, and abolish international equity, to do all those things and achieve a temperature rise of no more than 2 degrees would demand an impossible annual increase in emissions intensity. So that can't be done. So it can't be done by decoupling. It has to be done by attacking growth. So each perspective appears foolish from the standpoint of the other. For the green growthers, the no growthers are hopelessly idealistic. For the no growthers, the green growthers are just adding fuel on a fire or postponing the inevitable. So I want to do something that will have proponents of both sides want to hang me, which is suggest that there actually is some common element between the two grounds, between the two sides, at least if the green growth people are interpreted as meaning they want absolute decoupling. I mean, if it's just a kind of paper over the existing system, then that's not true. But I want to say that something like this is a kind of common underpinning. And this goes back to my argument about commonalities between the limits to growth and the Broman report, that at least the area of extensive economic growth must end. That's to say, growth that depends on continuously expanding the scale of environmental appropriations. I'm zipping along because I'm conscious of time.